Yes.
Okay, and let's see. I just like to get chat up and other things and participants. Just 1 second. Okay. Okay, so welcome to this talk. It's called Quarto and R Markdown. So what's different? So just to get an idea, and you can let me know in chat, how many of you are familiar with R Markdown? Yes or no? Okay. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully what I'm going to be showing you will like kind of convince you like it's interesting and like it might motivate you to kind of think about adopting either Quarto or R Markdown. So let's just talk about our agenda for today. Oh, and slides are available. Let me get my pointer. So slides are available. This is the link at the bottom. I pasted it into chat, and I can paste it again in just a second. Okay. So this is our agenda for today. So talk a little bit about what Quarto is. And if you're familiar with R Markdown, like, the question I had when I was starting was, is it worth switching? So I'm going to show you kind of some of the features. If we have time, we'll get into some tips about converting your R Markdown documents to Quarto. And then definitely, if you have any questions in the middle of it, you can either put it in chat or you can unmute yourself. I want this to be very kind of relaxed as possible. So thank you for the introduction. So yeah, like was stated previously, I'm a data science mentor for our Studio Academy. So I basically help teach data science for groups for our Studio Academy, usually about 10 weeks at a time. I'm also a bioinformatics trainer at a company called DNA Nexus. This is a little different than kind of what I do with teaching R. It's very much teaching about, getting your bioinformatics analysis onto the cloud. If you're interested in either, this is my Twitter handle and this is my web address. Okay, so let's get into what is Quarto. And before we get into the definition of Quarto, I just wanted to point out a couple of really great talks from our studio conference, if you haven't watched them yet. So really talking about, so Mine and Julia gave a great talk about, setting up a collaboration with Quarto. And I thought this was really neat because it shows a lot of the capabilities of Quarto and how you can use it in a real life setting. So they were basically, Julia was working with a group at NASA and they needed to get their IPython notebooks, their Jupyter notebooks up and running. And if you haven't seen it yet, Joe Cheng's Shiny Talk is really amazing. He kind of talks about the history of Shiny and, where it's going. It was just it was unexpectedly emotional, but it was a very good talk. So definitely recommend that. Okay, so what is Quarto? So if you go to the documents at quarto.org, it says it's a reproducible publishing system based on Pandoc. If you are familiar with R Markdown, or Pandoc, you'll know that basically the promise is that you have one kind of format of your document, your R Markdown file, and from that you can produce many different outputs. So Quarto is very similar, and we'll be talking about that in just a second. But really, I'll kind of highlight a lot of the uses for building Quarto presentations and websites, but you can also use it for publications, books, and if there's time at the end, I'll show you an example of a dashboard that I built using Quarto. So just to talk a little bit about kind of the technical details. Okay. Quarto works with .qmd files, which is short for Quarto Markdown. And the most important thing about Quarto that you need to know is that with R Markdown, you used to be able to, you basically ran it from RStudio, and you had to basically run it within RStudio. But the thing with Quarto is now that it's basically kind of, it's no longer, it is part of RStudio, but it can be used by other people in other languages. Especially with if you have different IDEs or integrated development environments. So there's plugins for if you're a VS Code kind of person, Visual Studio Code. There's one for Jupyter Lab and RStudio. So these are all kind of available. So if you are familiar with working with R Markdown, you'll know that there is that kind of R Markdown knit button. With Quarto, it's turned into what's called the render button. But the other thing to know about the Quarto is that there is this standalone executable. So this is actually built into RStudio. But if you're like, if you work in Julia or you work in Python, you can download this standalone executable. And then you can run this command called Quarto render. So this will basically take your document, your QMD file, and render it into various kinds of outputs. So the other thing about Quarto, so if you're familiar with R Markdown did support a couple of languages like R and Python. Quarto kind of increases that. Currently, there's also support for Julia and Observable.js. So that is kind of the JavaScript-based notebooks that let you do very kind of slick visualizations. Julia is another data science language. I have a link here. I won't show it too much, but there is a lot. This was a really great example from shoot, I can't spell sometimes. By Bob Rudis. So he showed basically, he had 3 different languages in the same notebook, and he showed how you can interchange data between all of those languages. It's a really neat example. So the other thing with Quarto is it's directly compatible with Jupyter notebooks. And you can actually interchange a Jupyter notebook. You can convert a Jupyter notebook into a Quarto document. So you can do this Quarto convert command, and then you give it the name of your Jupyter notebook, and it will output the equivalent QMD file. So if you like, Mine and Julia's talk, which I linked at the beginning of this talk, they really kind of emphasize this because the people they were working with at NASA basically had a lot of Jupyter notebooks, and they had to get them online. So it's a very fast way to get things online. So we'll talk a little bit about some concepts about Quarto that you just need to know, which is the idea that your code output is frozen. So when you are doing a Quarto render, unless you have kind of changed the code blocks, you won't recompute them. And oftentimes this is because you're just changing like the text, and basically re-rendering a notebook might be very kind of expensive computationally. So you have this option. If you want to recompute everything in your file, you can use this Quarto render -- execute. So what I mean when the code is frozen or the output is frozen, is that all of your files, like your graphics and everything, basically are stored in this directory. I believe it's called the freeze directory, and that contains all of your outputs. And then when Quarto actually does its render, it doesn't actually recompute. It just basically reads from that directory. Okay, any questions about this so far? Okay, so the other big difference with Quarto and R Markdown, let's see. Oh, sorry, I just got another person to admit. So if you're familiar with R Markdown, a lot of the times you put the options for rendering in a code chunk within that R. And it gets really, it can be really very difficult to kind of debug this. So let me show you an example of what I mean. So this is an example. You may see this a lot when you're starting an R Markdown document, and you'll see that within our options are included within the R within the curly brackets. But you can imagine that, like, there are a lot of options that you can set for a code chunk. And it's actually, I find it a little hard to work with that because sometimes, there's a lot of options and it's kind of hard to read and work with. So this is one of the big changes with Quarto is what this looks like instead of putting it within that R chunk or that code, these curly brackets, you've got what's called these hash pipes. So this is a hash and then a pipe symbol, and then you can put your options there. So I'll talk a little bit about kind of a way to kind of convert your code chunks in R Markdown to this format. In general, like when you're starting to kind of work with Quarto, this is kind of the preferred format for it. And you can use the R, this little R and curly brackets for setting options, but this is guaranteed to be the most compatible with Quarto and all of the other options. So let's just talk about what's different with Quarto. So, like, I just want to give you kind of the benefit of at least my experience with it is that Quarto is very different from R Markdown in that I think the YAML is or the front matter is very standardized across the formats. There were a lot of kind of split offs from R Markdown. If you were familiar with Jerrigan, that was one possible kind of output, which was basically a revealed JS presentation underneath it. But if you have worked with that, you'll know that those documents you can't just basically transform that into a PowerPoint file. You have to change some of the formatting in there. So that's one thing that I think is really helpful, is that a lot of the kind of HTML-based formats, they basically take a lot the same options. Like I mentioned before, Quarto is decoupled from RStudio, so people who've never touched RStudio can download it from quarto.org and then run it on the command line. So I'm going to be showing you kind of a couple of examples of, at least in terms of the HTML, how it's very useful and the presentation is consistent across formats. So I'll be showing you a couple examples, including tab panels and then multi-column layouts. And then this is the thing I get most excited about, which is code highlighting. So this was a nice quote from Yiwei. So again, the creator of R Markdown. So, this was a blog post. And so if you're asking yourself, should I switch to Quarto? He says, actually, not necessarily. So if you're like, you find that R Markdown meets your needs, then you can definitely stay there. So R Markdown is going to be there. They're basically kind of expanding Quarto's abilities, but it's not going to yet kind of eclipse R Markdown. So like I said, I just want to kind of show you some things about Quarto that I find really helpful. So these are just some of the HTML things that you can do. basically, so you can do kind of precise layouts with Quarto. You can do tab panels, and then I want to show you an example of code highlighting. So, again, I'm an educator, and like I welcome anything that kind of helps me present things in a way that is more understandable for students. And so these were the things that really kind of stuck out to me. So this is an example of a column-based layout. And you can see that these layouts are kind of defined by these colons here. So this top level is defined. You can see there's 4 colons here. And then in these curly brackets, there's this thing that defines, and it tells Quarto that this is going to be a column layout. So the way you define, oops, whoa. Apologies, let's see. The way that you define basically different columns is that within those four colons, you have these little containers of 3 colons here. And so this defines with that curly bracket and the column width, that defines kind of the width of that column in your layout. And then you can put your second column here. So you can put as many columns as you want. I would say after about 3 columns, it becomes less useful. But you can see you can also manage the proportions of each of these columns. So if I wanted my first column to be much larger than the second column, I could basically bump this up to 75% and this one to 25%. This part here, this is our second column here. And then we end with those 4 colons, which again corresponds to this kind of top level here. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So this is literally that code. And you can see that it was fairly easy to basically add multiple columns to your layouts. So there's a lot more in terms of layouts, like in terms of precise placing. So if you wanted to have like a picture, like, in the top right corner, you can definitely do that. So I would say the layout it's a lot more sophisticated than something like a Jerrigan or IO slides. Or Slidey. So these things, so I would say that this is kind of the first kind of reason you might want to consider moving over to Quarto. So this is an example of a tab set. So same idea, except that the tab sets are defined with three dots. And then with the curly within the curly brackets, you give it a dot panel dash tab set here. And then you define the tabs with these by using these 3 hash symbols here. So this part is going to be the first panel, and this is going to be the second panel. So this is what that looks like. So here's an example in which I have the code in one tab, and then I have the figure in another. And this is very helpful. Like, again, I'm very much about teaching. So I really like this kind of ability to basically kind of provide both your code and your figure. This could be really helpful when you are kind of doing a report as well. So this can be done in the basic HTML format. And you can basically have kind of the same multiple things kind of in the same space. There's also, like, as you notice here, there's code highlight, there's code kind of coloring, which is very helpful. Okay, so hopefully, Abu Bakr, so we have a limited amount of time left, so I'll just kind of try to kind of wrap things up here. So this is the thing that really convinced me to move over to Quarto, which is this idea of code highlighting. And this is, again, because I'm very much an educator, I always look for better ways to kind of teach things. And you can see I've added this option here, code dash line numbers. And this is to point out how this works. So it says I want to highlight the third line of the code first, and then the fourth through sixth of the lines code next, and then the seventh. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So this is that first code highlight. So you can see that everything else is grayed out. And then this is the second code highlight. And this is the third. So when I saw this, I was like very excited because I think I really tried to do kind of gradual teaching. And I think this is a great way of stepping people through code. Before we move on, any questions? Okay. So I just wanted to give you a couple of tips on how to move to Quarto. So this was kind of my best kind of approach. Yeah, so Vishal is asking, I think this code lighting applicable for both Python and Julia code also. Great question, Vishal. Yes, you can do it for both Python, Julia code. I've done it also for Bash code as well. So yeah, it's kind of, you have that ability to do that within any code chunk. So just kind of giving you a really simple checklist. This is not necessarily complete, but like at least to my experience, this is kind of the basics of getting started with Quarto. So the first is to start a Quarto project. And then for within your documents, you want to change the output in the YAML to format. And I'll show you an example of that in a second. And then you want to use this convert chunk header so to convert your code blocks. And then you can render your files. So I won't talk about the quarto.yaml file because of time. Okay, so within RStudio, you're able to basically start a new Quarto project. So if you go under File and then New Project, New Directory, and then Quarto Project, you're able to basically, that's going to instantiate everything you need for Quarto. You'll see that there's actually other options. So Quarto website and Quarto blog and Quarto book. I don't have time to really talk about that, but really my tip is really to start with a Quarto project, not to try to build all of these files yourself. So then you can take your R Markdown documents, and then you'll need to change a little bit of your front matter here. So the main difference is that you have in R Markdown, you have this output, and you need to switch that over to format. So I want to show you an example of that. So this was my talk in R Markdown format, and you can see that I have the output, and this was basically a Jerrigan, a Jerrigan presentation. So I'll show you what it should look like when you move to Quarto. So you can see I changed I don't know what these are called. These are basically this bit of front matter. So instead of output, it became format. And this format is a reveal.js presentation. So that's kind of one of the big changes that you need to make from your R Markdown files. So this is a busy table, but I just wanted to show you if you have R Markdown documents in with different outputs, what the equivalent Quarto format is. And I do point you to this FAQ for R Markdown here. This is very helpful, but you can get more information about all of these. These are all links here. Then you want to basically take, once you've edited that YAML or front matter, you'll need to do this convert chunk header. So This is in the knitter package here. And you'll see that there is, it'll take an input file name, and then it'll basically make a Quarto document with that same file name. The main thing this does is that converted chunk. So instead of having all of your options up here, again, it's going to put the options in your code chunk. And this is, again, for the reason of compatibility with Quarto. And then, once you have this, you can use the render button in RStudio. So there is a function called Quarto render, or there is that button in RStudio that you can use. If you're on the command line, you can render it via the command line. I don't have time to talk about this, but I definitely want, if you want to kind of read more about this and setting up a website with Quarto, I definitely want to point you to the documentation here. The other nice thing is Quarto has this command called Quarto publish, and it works with a lot of the web hosts that you might be familiar with. So GitHub pages, so this is the one I work with all the time. But they also have a service called quarto.pub, and you can sign up for a free account and you can put your Quarto documents up on there. Also notify and connect. So just a quick conclusion, because we are running out of time. Quarto supports multiple languages and integrated development environments. So Quarto standardizes a lot of the outputs, so they're consistent. I will say it does a better job of that promise of one document, many outputs. And there's a lot of publishing features I haven't really talked about because they're very in-depth, but you can do things such as references and figures. And so like the thought is you could have a single Quarto document to publish both your paper and a website, which I think is very cool. Just a quick link. So this is just some workshop materials from Andrew Bray, if you're interested in kind of converting your R Markdown documents to Quarto. And that's it. So kind of based on the time we have left, we have about 2 minutes for questions.
Right. Thanks, Ted. Yeah. Thank you, Ted.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have much time. We can take 1 or 2 questions. Any questions? Any questions?